and transported to the Caribbean, for example, where most of the people living there are enslaved and cultivating sugarcane, but have to eat as they do in the southern colonies. Could be transported across the Atlantic back to England, along with things like tobacco that we talked about, or rice, or wheat. All of these things that I've just mentioned are raw materials, things that are harvested from nature or cultivated. As opposed to manufactured goods, things are in one way or another made by human beings. So manufactured goods at that time in the colonies would mean what? I mean, we're just talking about one major one that they traded to the Wampanoag: firearms, guns, textiles, clothing, linens. Sugar would be a raw material, but let's say that you take you separate the sugar crystals from the molasses. Those sugar crystals end up maybe on a rich person's nice dining set, like that dining set, the plates, the silverware, the flatware, all that stuff is manufactured, right? Or here's one: you take the molasses, you learn you can distill that into liquor, into rum. So technically, that would be a manufactured good, and a major export from, say, Boston at that time. Everything from books to clocks, furniture, wigs, and anything that is made in some way as opposed to harvested as it is from nature. The key takeaway is this: the colonies are not doing hardly any manufacturing of goods. This is by design. For the British government, the point is for the colonies to export raw materials and to import manufactured goods. That is, they're a captive market buying your manufactured goods and giving to you these raw materials to use in various different ways, all to help you accumulate wealth. That's just a snapshot of settlement in the late 1600s. Go ahead. And then this shows you those different raw materials and manufactured goods that are crisscrossing the Atlantic Ocean. And today scholars will talk about an Atlantic world that encompasses West Africa, Western Europe, the Caribbean, North America, all as sort of a unified system. Unified in terms of the transport of goods, but also of human beings, both voluntarily and involuntarily. And eventually, as we'll see today, of ideas.
Did it trade with France now?
This is a good question. So a lot of what these countries, we call them the mother countries, the countries of Western Europe that have these colonies over here in the Western Hemisphere. They're trying to use their colonies to their utmost benefit and trying to shut other countries out. Now, does that mean you would never trade with England or with Spain or with German principalities? No, but what you want to do is funnel everything through Britain first. And that way you could regulate it, you could tax it.
Also meant that everyone over there didn't, also meant that any resources over there you got for 100% of the time instead of any of it possibly going to France if you didn't want to.
Right.
Made it illegal.
Yes, and what you do is you use taxes to kind of compel your colonists to buy your stuff. Like, could somebody in Savannah at the time, a rich slave owner building a house, if they wanted to import new glass windows for their house from France, could they do that? Yes, but it has to go through a British port first and it gets taxed. So it costs more than if you were to buy it from an English or British merchant. The thinking is you'd be compelled to buy the cheaper British product, and if you don't, then you pay taxes on it. All of it's designed to accumulate wealth. Do I have? I do not. Do I have? What these mother countries are doing? Nope. Marker. Oh, cheap things. They're practicing an economic system known as mercantilism. The root of that word is merchant, meaning a system largely operated by merchants, but for the benefit of those mother countries. Britain is doing it, France is doing it, Spain is doing it. They're all trying to shut each other out and accumulate as much wealth as possible. Let me ask you this one final point, and we'll transition. This is before the widespread advent of paper money. What was the money at that time that was used in trade and exchange?
Just barter.
could do that, yes, but let's say you do have some form of,
Was it gold?
yeah, so gold and silver coin, right? Or perhaps gold and silver bullion in cubes, but typically gold and silver coins, so those are precious metals. We call that specie, not to be confused with different species of living beings. Specie is gold and silver coin. Gold and silver are finite resources. What does that mean?
Stuff that we can find, like, it's like natural.
They're natural precious metals found in the ground, meaning there's only whatever amount there is on Earth, that's the amount there is on Earth, right?
Yeah,
You're not going to generate more. So what were you going to say?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. That means the amount that there is what it is. And so the thinking among these nations that are mother countries, the more we accumulate, the less for my rivals that there is. The more that we get as Britain, that's less for France, less for Spain, and you create this mercantilist system to try to do that. Does that make sense on a sort of basic level? Yeah.
So then that means America started trading with France and becoming partners when they started to become more independent as colonies?
Yeah, there was not a ton of direct trade. In fact, at some point, and depending on what kind of goods we're talking about, the British Parliament could step in and say, you can't trade with X country or Y country or whoever. Mostly they want to keep it on the basis of using taxes, like I was saying, taxing French stuff, Spanish stuff, Dutch stuff. Now what happens though if the British government for a period of time is not really paying close attention to those kinds of regulations? And think about this not necessarily in terms of manufactured goods directly from countries like France or the Netherlands or Spain. Remember, they've all got colonies here, and they all produce what? Down here? Specifically which one? Sugar, right? And remember the example of, like, say, the rum I was talking about? You need molasses that comes from down here. The British government would like you to get that sugarcane or molasses from Jamaica or Barbados, because those are British colonies. What happens, though, if nobody's regulating or paying attention to that, and over the years, colonists in, say, Boston, who were in the rum-making business, were paying off, bribing officials at the docks and smuggling it in from Dutch Curacao or French Saint-Domingue or Spanish Santo Domingo. And let's say eventually the British government realizes what's going on and tries to, put a stop to that. And that's where we pick up right up today.
Actually, really, what I'm really trying to ask is, when did the colonies become acquainted with the French where they could ask Napoleon to help them in the Revolutionary War?
The Revolution, yeah. So
it was just a wartime thing.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Also, Napoleon absolutely not involved with anything related to the American Revolution.
Yeah, it's the French Revolution occurs right on the heels of the American Revolution. And as we'll see in the next several lectures, there's a group of American leaders like Thomas Jefferson who want to have a cozy relationship with revolutionary France, which eventually becomes Napoleon, and there are others who are opposed to that. Obviously, the Louisiana Purchase.
Okay, I just thought there was a prior relationship being built.
It really begins with the Revolution. Yeah, so we will talk about that. If you could transition me to the new lecture.
Most of their relationship prior to this was inter-revolutionary war generals killing a bunch of French and people, killing a bunch of French colonists. For the British.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about Canada too, and you have to remember that Canada changes hands at one point between the French and the British, but there's still a lot of French people living there. So it's
the biggest reason Canada didn't participate in the revolution wasn't like it being loyal, it was location. Because Georgia was also like how large loyal population, but the thing was that Britain could get to Canada in about a quarter of the time it took them to get to anywhere else.
It's a good point. They also made serious concessions to the French Canadians, and during this period that we're going to look at here. And we're actually here. Look, we begin with talking about Britain and France. The 7 Years' War. This mercantilism was a great competition between those nations, those mother countries. Those countries in Europe that had colonies in the New World, competing with one another to accumulate wealth in the form of specie by regulating trade, by very closely regulating trade, specifically with their colonies. One of the truisms of modern history is that great competitions between nations will eventually lead to wars between those nations. In fact, part of the thinking in terms of these mother countries accumulating gold and silver specie was that when this inevitable war breaks out that everybody could sense would come at some point, you would be in a better position to win because you had more money. And so in a way, it's what you might call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like everybody was so worried about a general war and the things that they're doing in terms of this competition to bring that war about. So the 7 Years' War is fought between, on one level or another, most of the mother countries, most of the Western European nations that had colonies, but primarily for our purposes, Britain and France are the two main enemies in this war. And to put a very long and complicated story short, Britain wins. France loses. And that's going to have significant implications for the next 2 decades in these 13 British North American colonies. Why is George Washington up there? Look at this map, if you will. This shows you sort of who claimed to control what, and I say claimed because the majority of it was actually inhabited by Native Americans. But everything in red was the British colonies or claimed by Britain. Everything in blue was French colonies or claimed by France. Remember, France started up here in the St. Lawrence River Valley in Canada. But now they've spread into the Great Lakes region and up and down the Mississippi River. You've got these French place names like St. Louis and Detroit, but those are just little trading outposts. The point for right now is this. Look at the striped region. That's where you have competing claims. So Britain claimed it, France claimed it. It's mostly inhabited by Native Americans.
Isn't that called the frontier?
Yes, the frontier basically is a French word for borderlands, or the border. So this also corresponds, by the way, to the Appalachian Mountains. And so you would look up here in what's today modern-day western Pennsylvania or eastern Ohio, where the origins of the Ohio River are. And today the city of Pittsburgh is right there. The British over here in the colonies got wind that the French were building a fort there. And they claim that's theirs. Specifically, the colony of Virginia claimed it to be theirs. And so they sent a detachment, a small military detachment under the leadership of a then British officer, George Washington, a tobacco planter from Virginia, to basically make a show of force, to kind of show up and show the French, we have military here, you can't build a fort. And he totally screwed it up. He was not supposed to go there and start killing people and start a war, but he did not accurately convey that message to his Indian guides, who at one point executed some French soldiers. And that is the spark that ignites this much wider 7 Years' War.
Email wasn't around back then.
Huh?
Email wasn't around back then.
Exactly, yeah. Didn't quite fully get the message.
Probably bad translators.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
And that's what spurred the 7 Years' War? Is interaction?
Yeah, this is the kind of spark. I mean, the overall cause is this mercantilism, this competition, and trying to compete with one another to accumulate wealth and shut each other out of the benefits of trade with your colonies. But it's this bungling of a show of force operation around Fort Duquesne that actually sparks this wider conflict. Now, the big takeaway is kind of who gets what. Now, let me say, though, in terms of this second bullet point, you may have learned about this in grade school under the name of the French and Indian War. It's a confusing name because it suggests like either the French were fighting the Indians or the British were fighting against the French and the Indians. The reality is both sides had Indian allies. Native Americans were forced to kind of pick a side, and some chose to side with Britain, some chose to side with France. It just depends on who and where. But you could think about the French and Indian War as this huge 7 Years' War as it was fought here in America. The 7 Years' War, the argument has been made by historians, it's the first truly world war. Because these mother country nations like Britain and France had colonies all over the world, So when this pops off, they fight each other in Europe, in their own borders. They fight each other in America. Their navies are doing battle in the Caribbean. Their navies are fighting each other on the other side of the world in the Indian Ocean. So this French and Indian War is just kind of this, as we would say, theater of this larger conflict. Now, key takeaways, what are the results? So this is another way of looking at, again, who claims what. As you can see, before the wars, what it looked like on that last map, the French have all of this, the heart of Canada, the Great Lakes region. They claim all of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, which they named for King Louis, Louisiana. But look at what has happened in terms of the treaties ending 7 Years' War. Britain now has claim to everything east of the Mississippi River, including Canada, right? So the French are out. A lot of the people that will continue to live there are French people, but as a governing body, Britain now has control of all of that. Now, if you will quickly, though, jump forward one more, that's more the reality. You can see there are no real hard borders on the colonies here. You have the mountains, and then you have the reality that outside of a few towns or trading posts, most of this interior area between the mountains and the Mississippi River is occupied by the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Illinois, the Ojibways, the Miamis, and so on. These different Native American groups are actually living there. So consider a couple of things.
Was the Miami forced to move all the way to California?
I think that name gets adopted much, much later when they clear the swamps in the 20th century down there. There is a huge migration of Creek Indians down there. They become the Seminoles. But I don't think at any point the actual Miamis from up here migrated all the way down. Although there is that name, the place name does survive in Ohio. There is a Miami of Ohio University. Speaking of that region, actually, when the 7 Years' War is over, treaties are signed between the British and French. Nobody invites the different Native American leaders to sit down and say, hey, these are what we're concerned about. And they become especially alarmed. Consider if you had chosen the French as your side in the war. And France loses and has to pull out of the region, and now you're only left with the British who you had fought against. You're probably not going to have a warm relationship with them. And now you can't do what you had done historically, which is go to French traders and say, hey, the British traders are offering me this price. You know, you're asking for this much. Can't you do a better deal? Or vice versa. Now you just have the British to deal with. And so some of the Native Americans in this Great Lakes region, centered around Michigan, fought under the leadership of a chief named Pontiac in a rebellion known as Pontiac's Rebellion. And Britain has to take troops and resources to put that rebellion down. The significance of that is, 7 Years' War is over, no more French claims to like where Washington went to flex. Why not migrate over the Appalachian Mountains and take more and more and more land? Because that would cause more conflicts with the Native Americans. Go back one slide. So what they do is they draw this line. The British Parliament draws a line basically down the Appalachian Mountains and says, you can't settle across this line. Do not migrate across the mountains and settle. We can't afford for more Indian wars. Does that make sense? But think about it. The whole spark that started this thing happened because they were interested in settling across the mountains. And now you have the British government telling the colonists they can't do that, and they don't like it. And it breeds resentment.
I was about to say, wasn't a large part of the revolution the fact the colonists wanted to go past that line?
Yeah, and that's where we're headed right now. If you go back to yes. And you can see I have Pontiac's Rebellion here under this bigger bullet of war debt. So Britain wins the 7 Years' War, gets all of French Canada and part of French Louisiana. Basically, France is left with their islands in the Caribbean. Great victory, but it costs a lot of money. Britain doubled their national debt during the 7 Years' War. And when the war is over, they had to deal with Pontiac's Rebellion, which cost even more money to put that down. And that's why they draw the line, but also they're faced with the reality of we have to leave troops permanently in the colonies for our colonists' protection and the integrity of this land that we claim is ours. And we're also in this massive debt. So how do we address that? Everything that we see for the next 3 or 4 slides are ways in which Parliament and the King in Britain are looking at these 13 colonies and saying, you need to help pay this debt down. How can we use our colonies to generate revenue? That was the whole point of having colonies, to generate wealth and revenue. And here they have doubled, we've started a war that has doubled our national debt. What were the things that we do to tighten this up and to generate revenue, to pay that debt down, number one, and to offset the cost of keeping troops in the colonies, perhaps permanently, at least for the foreseeable future. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay, so remember when I was giving you examples of how the British government might use taxes to compel their colonists to buy from sort of within the British system, if you will. One way they had tried to do this decades before, when they passed a Molasses Act. And remember, molasses, when you spin the sugar crystals out of sugar cane, it's the thick, sweet liquid that's left over that can be used just by itself or to be distilled into rum. It passed this Molasses Act, which taxed sugar or molasses from British colonies at a very small rate. But it taxed sugar or molasses from other countries' colonies at a much higher rate. So that if colonists in, say, Boston, or Savannah for that matter, wanted to import sugar or molasses from a Caribbean colony, they could get it from a British one much cheaper than a French or Dutch or Spanish one, right? If they simply wanted to buy that shit because it was better, then great, because they're going to pay taxes on it. Or not. Because what's happening over the years leading up to the 7 Years' War, where the British Parliament and the British King were not keeping a close watch on what was going on in the colonies, is smuggling and bribery. Colonists were going to customs officials. These are officials of Parliament and the Crown at the docks in these ports where ships are coming in who are supposed to be collecting taxes. Instead, they're being paid a bribe to look the other way when colonists import sugar and molasses from Dutch or French or Spanish colonies, and they don't pay any taxes on it at all. So not only are they not buying the British stuff, they're buying other countries' stuff and not paying the tax on it. And when the 7 Years' War is over and they take a good, close look at the colonies, they realize that this has been happening. And so they pass a Sugar Act that will supersede or take the place of the Molasses Act. What does it do? Don't tell me on the quiz that the Sugar Act established a tax on sugar, because that's already there, right? So what does it do? Part of the argument that the colonists were making who were affected by this, specifically the ones who made rum in places like Boston, is that if they paid the tax or if they bought the British stuff, even with the small tax on the British stuff, their final product would cost too much and nobody would buy Boston rum. So Parliament says, okay, we'll actually lower the tax on British sugar and molasses. That's what the Sugar Act does. Lowers the tax on the British stuff, but then says we will heavily enforce this, even if it means using the native. We will go after smugglers. We will hold you accountable. We'll charge you with smuggling in violation of this act. And when you get put on trial, it won't be with your friendly colonist in Boston. It'll be what they call a vice admiralty court, which is a royal court where nobody's going to give a shit about your argument about your rum. So, to put that succinctly, the Sugar Act lowers the tax on British sugar and molasses, but significantly increases enforcement. enforcement. Lowers the tax, but increases enforcement through the use of the Navy.
Man, isn't enforcement the part that costs Britain even more money?
That's a good argument. Yeah, if they'd foreseen how long and drawn out this would be, that they might have had some foresight about that. But actually, to your point, even then they realized that's not going to be like the magic wand that pays down their massive national debt. That's not going to fully offset the ongoing cost of troops in the colonies. This was not going to be the solution to the debt problem or debt crisis. So the following year, they passed what becomes known as the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act does not establish a tax on stamps. So you can remember that the two acts on this slide. You know, the Sugar Act didn't establish a tax on sugar. The Stamp Act didn't establish a tax on stamps. In fact, they didn't really have what we would consider like postal stamps today. So why is it called the Stamp Act? What is it a tax on?
All paper.
Paper documents. Any and all paper documents. Everything from official documents like licenses, if you run a tavern or something, a property deed,
Down all the way to playing cards.
all the way down to even playing cards, books, newspapers, anything that's produced on and circulated as a paper document.
You had to buy a stamp to put on it.
Right. You would have to go to a customs official, pay a tax, and they would stamp your paper document so that if another customs official investigated or looked at it, they could see the stamp and know that you paid the tax. Make sense?
Was the stamp possibly made so that it would apply retroactively?
Yeah, if you, yes, and also if you were, say, like a newspaper printer, and back then that was how most news was disseminated. Every city or town in the colonies had a newspaper. You could purchase the paper essentially pre-stamped, right? So you would have to go and get every single page of every copy of every paper you put out physically stamped by the customs official. But let's think about this. A tax on sugar or molasses or anything else coming in or out of a colonial port. A tax on anything that's like imported into the colony or perhaps exported out of the colony to elsewhere. Those are what we call external taxes. Taxes on goods coming into or out of colonial ports. These paper documents we're talking about don't do that. By and large, they don't leave the colony. They're produced in the colonies, they are circulated in the colonies, they remain in the colonies. So if you were to tax and regulate something like that, that would be internal taxation. Make sense? Internal taxation, taxation on goods that are produced in, circulated in, stay in the colonies, as opposed to things like sugar or molasses that are coming into the colony from elsewhere, or coming in from outside, hence external. What is the significance of this? So, it's not that the colonists had never experienced the phenomenon of internal taxation before. It's that if there were to be those kinds of taxes on stuff like paper documents, everything, as you say, from official documents to newspapers down to playing cards, a tax like that would have been established by a colonial assembly. At that time, every one of the 13 colonies had an assembly of elected representatives, right? Like a parliament or a congress, but just for that colony. The difference here is this is an internal tax being placed on the colonists, not by a colonial assembly, but by Parliament. And other than the fact that Parliament sits in London, thousands of miles away, what is the key difference between it, Parliament, and these colonial assemblies? What did you learn was the pithy, short little phrase in grade school that it encapsulates everything about the American Revolution?
No taxation without representation?
No taxation without representation. The colonists did not get to elect members of Parliament in the House of Commons. They did not have lords or titles, individuals with titles that allowed them to sit in the House of Lords in Parliament.
Did the Church of England exist in the colonies?
Yeah, the church did, yes.
Their bishops there would also not get in the House of Lords, right?
I believe that's true, yes.
Yeah, just like how they don't.
Right. So, let's spin this again. Now, if you were at least white, male, and owned a certain amount of property, which is obviously very limited, but nonetheless, if you were a white male owning property in the colonies, you got to vote and elect representatives for the fill-in-the-blank assembly. Georgia, South Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, whatever.
Depending on your state, that was a bit more prominent. New Jersey allowed women, and some states allowed free black men that owned property as well.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But, point being, you did not get to elect, they call them, we call them members of Congress here, or congressmen, congresswomen. There they call them MPs, or members of parliament. There was no MP from Massachusetts. There was no MP from Georgia. There was no MP from Virginia. So the colonists did not get to vote and elect members of parliament. And their argument essentially is, if you want to add a couple words to that phrase, no internal taxation without direct representation. At this point, the colonists accepted that regulations on trade or external taxes were, okay, probably partly because they had been avoiding them. But internal taxes were another matter, and there are a couple things about this Stamp Act that make it particularly irritating to the colonists too. One, things like the Sugar Act applied to the entire British Empire. Stamp Act is directed only at the 13 British North American colonies. It felt they're being singled out. And then finally, the whole purpose of the Stamp Act is to generate revenue just for revenue's sake, money to pay down the debt, which the colonists didn't feel like was fair. Obviously, Parliament and the King did. What is the reaction to this? Is a big uprising, essentially, and a crisis of sorts, where the colonial assemblies start publishing statements saying these are the reasons why we don't think we should have to pay internal taxes imposed on us by Parliament, who we don't get to elect representatives to. Individuals in the streets organize into groups known as the Sons of Liberty. Liberty meaning freedom from internal taxation in this case. And they engage in all manner of street protests. In Boston, the founder of the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams, who was a failure as a brewer of beer, which is ironic because the company using his name is now quite successful. But what he was good at is organizing people, going into the taverns, which, you say the taverns, the bars, it's not just where people are getting, shitty drunk, although they were doing that at times. They were places of political organization. And Sam Adams would go into these taverns and organize people and rile them up based on this argument of no internal taxation without direct representation. Let's do something about it. Let's march through the streets with a coffin that says liberty on it because the British government is killing our freedom. Let's find the head customs agent in the city of Boston and publicly humiliate him by tarring and feathering him. This was the preferred humiliation of the day. They would strip an individual down. And if it was a planned event, you would have hot tar on hand. If it's more spontaneous, cold tar will do. But you coat the individual in tar, and then you pour goose feathers all over them. And then they're covered in goose feathers. And if you had planned it right, and the tar was hot, they're probably writhing around from pain, and so they look, of course, ludicrous. It's humiliating, and how are you supposed to put forth yourself as a person of authority after such an event? And indeed, the individual in this case resigns. No one is eager to take his place, and for a period of time, the Stamp Act tax just goes uncollected in Massachusetts because there's nobody to collect it. Now, there were people at this time who were vehemently against these protests. They were what we will come to call loyalists, and that would include the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. But what happens when he tries to put these protests down? He doesn't have like a police force. There's no Boston police at the time. There's no Massachusetts National Guard. So what can he do other than complain back to Parliament and say, what can we do about this? What Parliament does about this is twofold. One, they repealed the Stamp Act. What does repeal mean? Take back, do away with it, write off the books. And if that was seen as giving in or capitulating to the colonists, which they did not want to do, Parliament simultaneously issues what they call a declaratory act, which says, we're not doing this because we think you are right. We're not doing this because of your argument of no internal taxation without representation. We're doing this as a practical matter, and just so you know, we can tax whoever we want for whatever reason we want anywhere in the empire. And so that shows you the attitude that they will have moving forward. So, Stamp Act is repealed. You still have the huge debt. What are you going to do? The next step is the passage and enactment of what they call the Townsend Acts. Townsend was what they call in Britain the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We would call it the Secretary of the Treasury. He's the guy who's responsible for figuring this out within the ministry, or we would say here the cabinet. His thinking was, all right, let's go back to external taxation. Let's think of some stuff that the 13 North American colonies import besides just sugar that we could tax them on and raise revenue that way. Things like glass, lead, paper in bulk, not internally circulated ones, and tea. Those are all raw materials that were from other parts of the British Empire, glass, lead, paper, tea, that the colonists in North America imported. And now you're going to pay a tax in order to import that stuff. These become known as the Townsend Act taxes, or the Townsend duties. You see duties in an economic sense, that means taxes on imports. So the thinking was, surely our colonists won't be up in arms and upset about this. Their argument was about internal taxes. That's not what this is. But they didn't account for a couple of things. One, the lesson that the colonists who had participated in those protests took from the Stamp Act crisis was, if we don't like something, we can protest against it and get it done away with. We have that power. And then two, there's something about the Townsend Acts that the British Parliament and King didn't fully consider how the colonists would react to it. That is, the revenue that was going to be raised, the money that was going to be made from these taxes or collected, was earmarked. When we say earmarked, it's like the page of a paper is folded at the top. And it means that certain of this revenue was set aside for a specific purpose. And that specific purpose was going to be to pay the salaries of judges and governors in the colony. People like Thomas Hutchinson. That is something that had previously been done by the colonial assemblies. They paid the salaries of their judges and governors. Now that's going to be done by Parliament. Why would they do this? They're trying to buy them off. They're trying to make sure that those judges and governors remain loyal to Parliament and the King and not sympathetic to these protesters. Does that make sense? And the protesters know it and they don't like it. They see that what Parliament is doing is trying to buy off their officials to keep them in their pocket. So the result is more street protest, more harassment of customs officials, more rhetoric about our liberty and freedom being taken away, and also boycotts of those goods. They say, well, Parliament wants to tax us for importing glass, lead, paper, and tea. Well, we just won't import those things. You can send them over and we won't offload them.
They did have a lot of sand. Like, I don't think that importing glass would have been super necessary.
That what?
They did have a lot of sand.
Yeah.
I think they could have gotten around needing to import glass if they wanted to.
True. And I will say, even setting aside production of it, there were some individuals who didn't want to go along with this boycott, individuals who continue to import those things like tea and to sell those, and look what happens. This is from a newspaper. So let's say it's let's say King Street. Let's say it's a newspaper from Charleston in South Carolina. A list of the names of those who audaciously continue to counteract the united sentiment of the body of merchants throughout North America by importing British goods contrary to the agreement, meaning the boycott agreement. John Gillespie in Queen Street has imported a quantity of glass contrary to the agreement of merchants, and he refuses to reship them. John Bernard in King Street, opposite the wharf at Vernon's Head, so on and so forth. So they're outing these people who refuse to go along, putting them on blast and saying, this is where you can find those people to harass them. And, go and smear feces all over their house. It's just something that literally happens. So, continued harassment of public officials if they are not sympathetic to the movement. Hutchinson in Boston gets his house vandalized pretty badly in the process. And so he and others start to call the Parliament and say, we need help, we need troops. We need soldiers of the British Army over here to help maintain order. And Boston was the worst of the worst in their view. It had become essentially lawless in Hutchinson's telling of it, the governor. And so they send over 3,000 British troops and force the residents of Boston to quarter them, that is, provide a space for them to live and eat and train. And they more or less begin to police the streets of the city of Boston. And these are not troops that had been raised in and trained in and brought over to Britain from the colonies. They're from Britain. They're outsiders, in other words, to the colonists. And they carry themselves, as most royal officials did, as better than the colonists, and looked down on them and pushed them out of the way when they were on the side of the street and this kind of thing, or wouldn't harass them at their homes or places of business. And it was a situation that was almost bound to lead to some kind of incident. And that incident becomes known as the Boston Massacre. So one night, there are a few troops that were guarding the customs house in Boston. I mean, that's like target number one where the tax collectors are. So there are troops outside standing guard. And as would happen from time to time up to this point, over the weeks and months where troops are in Boston, some colonists to the city who'd been drinking a little bit in the tavern gather on the other side of the street and start chirping at him, start yelling insults at him, taunting him. And that crowd grows larger and larger. The troops start to get a little nervous. They call, from down the street for reinforcements, and what had been 2 or 3 troops ends up being a much larger contingent. The colonists start throwing their snow on the ground. They start throwing snowballs. Some of those snowballs are rocks covered in snow. So we're getting a little bit more and more towards violence here. Now the colonists, other than the rocks, are unarmed. Obviously the soldiers are not unarmed. At some point, somebody freaked out and a shot was fired. And then someone yells fire. The commander of the troops later would say, it was not me. But somebody yelled fire, and then everybody among the troops start firing into this unarmed crowd of protesting, harassing colonists on the streets of Boston, and 4 people are killed.
Isn't John Adams the lawyer for these soldiers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll say a word about that. But first, I want you to look at this rendering. Now, given what I have just told you about this chaotic incident that unfolds at night, and all the attendant confusion surrounding that, and the feelings on both sides, what about this rendering might you judge to be inaccurate or misleading? Are these colonists on the left throwing rocks? Are they harassing the soldiers in any way at all?
Doesn't that appear that looks like a bunch of British soldiers amassed just to mark down a bunch of people?
Is that a dog?
Yeah. So let's break that down. Perfectly innocent colonists minding their own business, right? No harassment, no nothing, no throwing rocks, no yelling insults.
Wait, so that wasn't true? So that wasn't true?
See? So, yes, it was true. So hang with me. So you have extreme violence. This guy's head got blown off. This guy's spurting blood. There's a poor little dog, as you noticed, even standing there. This guy's being carried away, so maybe he'll live. But then over here, what else do you see? Scared and confused soldiers? No, look at the faces. I mean, they are into this. They are really excited and happy to be murdering some innocent Bostonians.
I mean, the only one we know of the real mental state of at the time without being influenced for trial was the captain who was actively trying to get his soldiers not to shoot them. And look at him, he's raising his sword up.
Right there, order to fire clearly being given, right? So soldiers being ordered to and very happily murdering, massacring, look up here, the bloody massacre. That's where we get the name from, some totally innocent colonists. This is a woodcut that's was in the form that it gets into colonial newspapers and all the way from Boston to Savannah, and colonists read the newspaper and they see this. This is how they learn about this incident. This is actually produced by a guy named Paul Revere, who you probably know from other parts of this story later. This is how they learn about it, and they don't see probably what was more of the reality, a chaotic situation on the streets at night. You can't hardly tell who's who. People drunk, looks like maybe even guns on both sides. No order to fire being given. Chaos and fear. A much more complicated situation, in other words. And yet, that's not how the colonists learn about it. They learn about the deaths of these 4 people. There are these long, long accounts which give you that Paul Revere version of the events, that it was this bloody, premeditated, unprovoked massacre, right? And it makes people angry in the colonies, all the way down to Savannah and down to New York and everywhere in between, and it makes them scared. And they start to think if Parliament could do this to Boston, what's to say they won't do it to us in Savannah or Charleston or New York or Philadelphia or wherever else? So go back.
So basically, Paul just started a pot, basically.
Yeah. In order to get people to fall on the side of what's becoming known as this patriot or protest movement and to not be loyalists. So what, though, is the response to this? You mentioned a couple of the soldiers are put on trial. They're defended, actually, by John Adams, who would later become President of the United States. They get off basically with a slap on the wrist, and Parliament recalls the troops back home. So they do remove the troops from Boston. But think about the lingering aspect of this, when colonists now can think, no matter where you are, not just in Boston, but Britain might send troops over to murder you. Parliament does repeal some of the Townshend Act taxes, but they leave in place one, and I bet you can guess what it is. From other major events of the American Revolution. Yeah, tea. So they repeal the Townshend Act duties on glass lead paper and leave in place the tax on tea. Questions? Go ahead. Under a mercantilist system, these nations sometimes operated using monopolies. What's a monopoly? We don't like monopolies in capitalism because they're bad for us, the consumer. But remember, mercantilism was not geared towards the consumer. It was geared towards the merchants in the mother countries accumulating wealth in the form of specie.
About that economy, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
Including
So-
the people the economy's supposed to benefit.
Yeah, we'll talk later about scholars looking back and critiquing what was wrong with this system and developing what we now have, which is capitalism, which obviously has many of its own problems, but not to digress. The point is, a monopoly is a company that has more or less complete control over trade in a certain item. So consider if, I always use the cell phone analysis, I'm going to purposely use a different one. What if Tesla was the only company that made cars? They could charge you whatever the hell they want for an automobile, and we got to have cars, so what are you going to do about it? It's bad for consumers. But in a mercantilist system, that wasn't the point. It's about generating wealth for the mother country. And so sometimes there would be a company that was used by Parliament and the King, in this case, by the government, to exclusively regulate trade in a certain commodity, in this case tea, and that is the British East India Company. Much of Britain's tea came from India, which was a British colony at the time as well, which I do this a lot more in the world. Hit me with the middle map again. But I should do it in here too. I learned that they don't teach geography anymore. So here are the 13 colonies, of course, and if you go east, next. This is Europe, obviously, the Middle East, and here is India, right? So the British had colonized India and had a lively trade in which they shipped goods back through Britain, and then some of it eventually onto the colonies, and that included tea. Go back to slideshow. What does the Tea Act do? This is now our third act with a name that would suggest it establishes a tax on something, and that's not the case. Because the tax on tea is already in place, because it was one of the Townshend Act tax. They didn't repeat it. So what does the Tea Act do? It allows the British East India Company to ship tea directly to the colony, the American colony. Whereas previously they had to go from India through Britain. It was taxed and regulated and warehoused, and then it could be sold to the colony. But the British East India Company was suffering and was on hard times. And it was incumbent upon Britain's Parliament and King to sort of bail them out and to allow them to skip the step of warehousing and taxation in Britain and to ship this stuff directly to the colonists. But the colonists still have to pay their tax on it. And by this time, taxation is obviously a hot button issue in these colonies. So in response to this, some of the Sons of Liberty in Boston decide when that tea comes into their harbor that they're going to not only refuse to offload it, but they're going to take things a step further. Now this had happened in other ports in the colonies, and typically the ship's captains just turned around and left, and like, we couldn't get anybody to offload it. There was actually a law that the ship could only be in port for 2 weeks or something, and you had to leave. But Hutchinson in Massachusetts is still the governor, and he decides he's going to put his foot down and force this tea to be offloaded and tell the merchant ships captains, the British East India Company, don't leave the port. I'm going to make them do this. And then one night, out of the taverns come some of these Sons of Liberty with coal dust on their face and a feather in their hair, like vaguely disguised as Indians, so you could deny that you had anything to do with this after the fact. But they row out to these ships and commandeer them or take control of them, bust up the chests and throw them overboard into the harbor so that it would get water in the chests and it would be ruined. And this is the equivalent of, hundreds of thousands of dollars of tea. And consider if the British East India Company is what they would characterize as a preferred crown monopoly. In a manner of speaking, it could be interpreted that this was the king's tea. And the king gets very upset, as do other members of Parliament. And the response to what we know in history as the Boston Tea Party, the destroying of this tea in Boston Harbor, was the passage of the Coercive Acts. So what do the Coercive Acts do? We will not finish. We will have to carry on to the next one. But I do want to say, what are the Coercive Acts? First of all, Parliament announces the closure of Boston Harbor to be enforced by the Navy. No ships in or out. Consider that is the lifeblood of that colony. The colony depends on exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods. And this would have an effect broadly on everybody in that colony if it were to linger. The closure of Boston Harbor. The suspension of the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. A colonial charter was like a constitution for each colony and laid out the way that colony would be governed. Why does Parliament suspend it? Because they put a ban on what they call town meetings. Every town or city, from big old Boston down to little towns like Salem, had a town meeting that was basically like a city council. And they organized local affairs. Parliament thought that those town meetings or little city councils were what had organized stuff like the Boston Tea Party. And so they prevented them. But those had a long tradition going all the way back to the Puritans. And that has reverberating effects. They send troops back. Troops are coming back to Boston. They replace Thomas Hutchinson with another individual as governor by the name of Thomas Gage. Thomas Hutchinson was a lawyer. Thomas Gage is a general in the British Army. What else? They pass a quartering act that says you have to quarter these soldiers again. That means you got to pay for where they live and what they eat and where they train. They pass what the colonists call a murder act, which says if any crown officials, including soldiers, commit crimes in the colonies, like what happened in the Boston Massacre, they don't get tried in the colonies, they get a trial back in London. Where the thinking of the colonists was that they would get away with whatever it is they do. Even maybe murder. Right? At the same time, to your earlier point about former French colonists that remain living in Canada, they pass an act that allows them to practice Catholicism in the views of the British colonists, do whatever the hell they want. And so the upshot of all of this was two things. One, it effectively means it is a military occupation of the colony of Massachusetts. Two, for the colonists in Boston, it was simply intolerable. So they call these coercive acts the intolerable acts. And again, consider when word spreads from Massachusetts down through Rhode Island, through New York and Virginia and down to Georgia, the thinking is if Parliament and the King could do it to Massachusetts, they could do it to us too. And so they begin to organize and think and work and act together, 13 colonies as one. And so I will capitulate to you with 2 minutes remaining. Then we'll talk about the First Continental Congress next time. Bye. Lexington and Concord, basically. Yeah. Might have